footage played on every news channel across the country, but it was the audio that made the world hold its breath. "I'm not just another passenger you can throw off this plane," Mabel Palacios said, her voice steady as steel while two security guards flanked her in the aircraft aisle. "I'm Mabel Palacios, and I own Sterling Airways." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for flight attendant Everly Hull's face to drain of all color, for pilot Logan Jarvis to freeze in the cockpit doorway, and for 147 passengers to realize they were witnessing the most explosive corporate reckoning in aviation history. Welcome, and prepare to be captivated. This is Powder Room Tales, where every story is crafted with one thing in mind: you. Our tales are addictive, emotional, and unforgettable. So if you're new, subscribe now and turn on notifications to ensure you don't miss a single one. Tell me, from which city are you joining our community of story lovers? Your location in the comments below helps us connect with our family across the world. And don't forget to come back tomorrow. I have another tale prepared that will keep you on the edge of your seat. May God bless every one of you, my amazing Powder Room Tales family, with a long, joyful, and fulfilling life. Let's begin today's story. The mahogany conference table in the Sterling Airways boardroom stretched 12 feet, polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the faces of executives who believed they knew everything about their company. They were wrong. "Revenue is up 18% this quarter," announced Richard Blackstone, his silver hair catching the morning light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta's skyline. "Our customer satisfaction ratings are at an all-time high." Around the table, heads nodded in approval. Vice President of Operations Janet Chen smiled as she flipped through quarterly reports. "Our crew performance metrics are exceptional. Flight Attendant Hull received another commendation last month for maintaining first-class standards." None of them noticed the woman sitting quietly at the far end of the table, taking notes on an iPad, her presence so understated that she might have been a corporate secretary. Mabel Palacios, 43 years old, wore a simple black blazer and minimal jewelry. Her natural hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her dark eyes absorbed every word while revealing nothing. "What about the diversity initiatives?" asked Marketing Director Tom Walsh, a question that made several executives shift uncomfortably. "Progressing well," Janet replied quickly. "We've increased minority hiring by 12% across all departments." Maple's pen paused against her notepad. 12%? She'd built Sterling Airways from nothing 15 years ago, using a complex web of investment firms and holding companies to maintain her anonymity. She wanted to create an airline that represented excellence without bias, where success was measured by competence, not color or gender. The irony of sitting invisible in her own boardroom while executives discussed her company's diversity initiatives wasn't lost on her. "Any operational concerns?" asked Blackstone. "Minor passenger complaints," she waved dismissively. "Nothing that affects our bottom line. Our crew handled difficult situations with professionalism." Difficult situations. Mabel had read those reports. She knew what difficult often meant in corporate speak, especially when it came to passengers who didn't fit the expected first-class demographic. It was time for another field observation. "I'll be traveling to Miami this afternoon," Mabel said quietly, her first contribution to the meeting. Client consultation.
Janet nodded without really listening. "Of course, Miss Palacios. Will you need any special arrangements?" "Just my usual booking. First class on the 4:15 flight." 3 hours later, Mabel stood in Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, deliberately dressed down in dark jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable flats. Her Louis Vuitton bag was replaced with a nondescript black carry-on. She'd learned long ago that traveling as herself, without the corporate armor of expensive suits and obvious wealth, revealed truths that executive reports could never capture. At Gate B27, Sterling Airways Flight 447 to Miami was preparing for boarding. Mabel observed from a distance, watching the crew prepare. The gate agent, a young woman with blonde highlights, processed passengers with mechanical efficiency. Business travelers in expensive suits received warm smiles and immediate assistance. Families with children got polite but hurried service. Then Mabel watched an elderly black woman approach the counter with confusion about her boarding pass. The agent's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. Cooler, more clipped, speaking slower as if the woman couldn't understand English. The interaction lasted 90 seconds longer than necessary, causing the woman visible embarrassment. Mabel's jaw tightened, but she remained still, observing. On the aircraft, the pre-flight briefing was taking place in the crew quarters. Flight attendant Everly Hull, a 12-year Sterling Airways veteran with bottle blonde hair and a crisp uniform that fit like a second skin, gathered her team around the small table. "We have a full first-class cabin today," Everly announced, consulting her passenger manifest. "Some high-value customers, including several platinum members. Let's make sure we maintain our Sterling Airways standards." Her tone carried weight that the newer flight attendants recognized immediately. Everly Hull was known throughout the Sterling Airways system as someone who ran a tight ship and knew how to handle situations. Management loved her efficiency ratings and customer feedback from the right kind of passengers. "Any special requests?" asked Jessica, a newer flight attendant with nervous energy. "Nothing unusual. Just remember, first class is about creating an exclusive experience. Our passengers expect a certain atmosphere." Her pause was loaded with meaning that needed no explanation. "If anyone seems out of place or creates disruption, handle it quietly and efficiently. We protect the comfort of our premium customers above all else." In the cockpit, Captain Logan Jarvis was conducting his own pre-flight routine. At 46, he'd been flying for Sterling Airways for 8 years and had built a reputation for running smooth flights. His co-pilot, Mark Stevens, was reviewing weather reports while Logan checked passenger lists. "Full house today," Mark commented. "Should be a profitable run." Logan nodded, his attention caught by something on his passenger manifest. "First class is completely sold out. Good to see the company doing well." Neither pilot nor crew realized that among their first-class passengers was the woman who signed their paychecks, who had created the corporate culture they were about to demonstrate, and who was traveling specifically to see if her airline lived up to its stated values. Mabel approached the boarding gate with her ticket clearly visible. Seat 1A, first class, properly purchased and confirmed. She had deliberately chosen the most premium seat on the aircraft to see how she would be received as a black woman claiming space in the airline's most exclusive section. The gate agent scanned her ticket without incident, but Mabel caught the double take, the momentary surprise that flickered across the young woman's features before professional training kicked in. "Have a pleasant flight, Miss Palacios." As Mabel walked down the jet bridge toward her own aircraft, she felt the familiar mixture of hope and dread that came with these undercover observations. Sterling Airways was her legacy, built on principles of excellence and equality. But she had learned that corporate values meant nothing if they didn't translate to individual actions when nobody was watching. She was about to discover just how deep that disconnect ran. Behind her, the gate agent was already on her radio. "Flight attendant Hull, we have a passenger in 1A who might need extra attention. Just wanted to give you a heads up." The pieces were falling into place for a collision that would change everything: owner and employees, privilege and prejudice, theory and reality. Mabel had no idea she was about to become the victim of discrimination within her own company, and her crew had no idea they were about to discriminate against the most powerful person in their professional lives. The aircraft door was still open, passengers still boarding, when the first threads of injustice began to weave themselves into a tapestry that would soon unravel careers, expose systemic bias, and force a reckoning 15 years in the making. Flight 447 was about to become the most important flight in Sterling Airways history, though none of them knew it yet. Have you ever witnessed discrimination in a service setting? What would give you the courage to speak up? What would you do if you discovered the company you worked for had a culture of bias you never recognized? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to see how this explosive confrontation unfolds.
Mabel Palacios stepped through the aircraft door of her own airline, boarding pass in hand, seat 1A, first class, Sterling Airways Flight 447. The irony was almost suffocating. She designed this very cabin layout 3 years ago, choosing the cream leather seats and brushed steel accents that now surrounded her. Every detail reflected her vision of luxury without pretense, excellence without exclusion. She was about to discover how far reality had drifted from her ideals. The first-class cabin buzzed with the quiet efficiency of pre-departure preparations. Business executives settled into their seats, opening laptops and adjusting reading lights. The atmosphere hummed with the kind of understated privilege that came with being able to afford a $1,200 seat on a 3-hour flight. But seat 1A, her seat, was occupied. A white man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled polo shirt and khakis, had spread his belongings across the premium real estate of row 1. His laptop bag occupied the seat next to him, his jacket hung on the armrest, and he was already nursing what appeared to be his second scotch and soda. Mabel approached calmly, her boarding pass clearly visible. "Excuse me, I think there might be some confusion. This is seat 1A, my seat." The man looked up with the kind of irritated expression reserved for minor inconveniences. "I don't think so, sweetheart. I'm David Chen, a gold status member. I requested an upgrade and they moved me up here." "I understand, but I have seat 1A confirmed." Mabel held out her boarding pass, keeping her voice level and professional. "Perhaps you could check with the flight attendant about your seat assignment?" David Chen barely glanced at her ticket. "Look, honey, I fly Sterling Airways every week. I'm sure there's been some mistake with your situation. Maybe they can find you something in the back." The dismissive tone, the refusal to even look at her documentation, the casual assumption that she didn't belong, all of it crystallized into a moment of recognition that made Mabel's chest tighten. This was what her other customers experienced. This was what she'd unknowingly built a company culture to enable. "Sir, I'd appreciate if you just look at my boarding pass." "Is there a problem here?" Everly Hull appeared like a specter of authority, her silver wings pin catching the overhead light. At 51, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd resolved thousands of passenger disputes and knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Her eyes swept over the scene. David Chen, clearly comfortable in his claimed territory, and Mabel Palacios, a black woman holding a boarding pass and looking exactly like what Everly had been trained to identify as a potential disruption to first-class serenity. "This woman claims she has my seat," David said, not bothering to lower his voice. "But I was upgraded. Gold status privilege, you know?" Everly's smile was professional and cool as winter air. "Of course, Mr. Chen. Let me just sort this out." She turned to Mabel with the kind of patient expression reserved for confused children and difficult customers. "Ma'am, there seems to be some confusion about your seat assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Mabel handed over the document, watching Everly's face for recognition, for acknowledgement, for basic professional courtesy. Instead, she watched her employee, study the boarding pass with the kind of suspicious scrutiny typically reserved for counterfeit currency. "This shows seat 1A, but Mr. Chen has been upgraded to this seat due to his status level. Sometimes the computer system doesn't update properly when we make these adjustments." Everly's tone was condescending, each word carefully measured. "Let me check what other accommodations we can arrange for you." "Accommodations?" Mabel's voice remained steady, but something cold was crystallizing in her chest. "This is my confirmed seat. I paid for this specific seat." "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but we need to prioritize our valued customers. Mr. Chen flies with us regularly and has status privileges that allow for these upgrades. I'm sure we can find you something comfortable in our main cabin." The words hit like physical blows. Valued customers, status privileges. The implication was crystal clear. Mabel didn't qualify as valuable, didn't deserve the first-class treatment she literally created in the airline she literally owned. Other passengers were starting to notice the commotion. A woman in seat 2B looked up from her magazine with barely concealed annoyance. A businessman in 3A shook his head and returned to his phone, clearly irritated by the disruption to his privileged space. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside so we can resolve this quietly. You're disrupting our other passengers."
"I'm creating a disruption." Mabel's composure began to crack, not from anger, but from the sheer devastating weight of recognition. "By trying to sit in the seat I paid for?" From the cockpit, Captain Logan Jarvis emerged to assess the situation. He'd heard raised voices through the cabin door and knew from experience that first-class disturbances needed immediate attention. His 8 years with Sterling Airways had taught him to trust Everly Hull's judgment implicitly. "What's the situation, Hull?" His voice carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. "Passenger confusion about seat assignments, Captain. I'm handling it." Logan studied the scene with the analytical precision of a pilot. One clearly legitimate first-class passenger, David Chen, relaxed and confident. One flight attendant he trusted completely, Everly Hull, professional and composed. And one passenger who seemed to be causing trouble, a black woman claiming ownership of a seat that was obviously occupied by someone with proper authority. "Ma'am," Logan addressed Mabel directly, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I'm Captain Jarvis. I understand there's been some confusion, but I need you to understand that we can't delay this flight over seating disputes. Flight Attendant Hull is experienced in resolving these issues. I suggest you allow her to help you." The irony was so complete it took Mabel's breath away. The pilot she paid, flying the aircraft she owned, using the authority she'd granted him, was now telling her to submit to discrimination from the crew she employed. "Captain, I have a confirmed seat assignment. This is seat 1A, which I booked and paid for." She held out her boarding pass again, hoping that rank would command the respect that her personhood apparently could not. Logan glanced at the boarding pass with the same dismissive efficiency he'd used to check weather reports. "Ma'am, our passenger accommodation policies are designed to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. Sometimes that means making adjustments. I'm sure we can find you appropriate seating." Appropriate seating. The phrase hung in the air like toxic smoke. "You know what?" David Chen interjected, clearly enjoying his role as the reasonable party. "I don't want any trouble, but I do have gold status, and I was told this seat was available. I'm not trying to cause problems, but I do have my rights as a frequent flyer." "Absolutely, Mr. Chen," Everly assured him. "Your status entitles you to these accommodations. We appreciate your understanding." Mabel watched her own employees protect David Chen's comfort while systematically dismantling her dignity. She watched them use company policy, her policies, to justify treating her as a second-class citizen in her own business. The board meeting from that morning echoed in her memory. Our crew handles difficult situations with professionalism. This was their professionalism. This was her company culture in action. "I'm not moving," Mabel said quietly. The words fell into silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension throughout the first-class cabin. Everly's professional mask slipped slightly. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but if you continue to be disruptive, we'll have to involve airport security." Disruptive. Mabel repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. "I'm being disruptive by trying to sit in the seat I purchased?" "You're being disruptive by refusing to accept alternative accommodations and by creating a scene that's uncomfortable for our other passengers," Logan said firmly. "Last chance to resolve this cooperatively." Mabel looked around the cabin at the faces of her first-class passengers, her customers, people whose business supported the company she'd built from nothing. Not one met her eyes. Not one showed a flicker of recognition that what they were witnessing was wrong. She thought about the board meeting that morning, about executives discussing diversity initiatives while she sat invisible. She thought about 15 years of building Sterling Airways into something she could be proud of, only to discover that pride and reality were separated by a chasm of willful ignorance and institutional bias. Call security. The word surprised everyone, including herself. Excuse me? Everly blinked. Call airport security. I want this documented. I want witnesses. Mabel's voice was steady now, powered by something deeper than anger. Because what's happening here isn't a seating dispute. This is discrimination, and I want it on record. Logan's face darkened. Ma'am, you're making a serious allegation. I'm making an accurate allegation, and I want security here to document how Sterling Airways handles passengers who don't look like they belong in first class.
As Everly reached for her radio to call security, none of them could have imagined that they were about to remove the owner of Sterling Airways from her own aircraft, or that this moment would trigger the most explosive corporate scandal in aviation history. They were all about to learn that sometimes the person you discriminate against is the person with the ultimate power to destroy your career. The call went out. Security to gate B27, passenger removal required. What none of them knew was that they just made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. When you witness discrimination, what stops you from speaking up? What would it take for you to intervene? The discrimination has started, but the explosion is coming. What do you think happens when they discover who they're really dealing with? Hit that notification bell to see the most shocking corporate scandal unfold. Airport security arrived in less than 4 minutes. 2 uniformed officers who approached gate B27 with the weary professionalism of people who handled countless passenger disputes. Officer Martinez, a 15-year veteran of Hartsfield-Jackson Security, and Officer Thompson, newer but eager to prove himself, had no idea they were about to escort an airline owner off her own aircraft. "What's the situation?" Martinez asked Everly Hull, who had positioned herself strategically between the officers and Mabel, creating a visual narrative of authority versus disruption. "Passenger refuses to accept alternative seating arrangements," Everly explained, her voice carrying the patient exhaustion of someone dealing with an unreasonable person. "She's claiming ownership of a seat that's been properly assigned to one of our gold status members. When we offered to accommodate her elsewhere, she became increasingly agitated and disruptive to our other first-class passengers." Martinez nodded, studying Mabel with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess threats. What he saw was a black woman in casual clothes, holding a boarding pass, standing calmly in an environment where she clearly didn't belong, at least according to the crew's body language and the uncomfortable shifting of nearby passengers. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Martinez. I understand there's been some confusion about your seating assignment." The word confusion hit Mabel like a slap. Not discrimination, not policy violation, not illegal treatment. Confusion. As if her grasp of reality was the problem, not the systematic bias playing out in front of witnesses. "Officer, there's no confusion on my part." Mabel's voice remained level, though something cold was solidifying in her chest. "I have a confirmed first-class ticket for seat 1A. When I arrived, I found another passenger in my seat. Instead of resolving the conflict according to standard airline procedure, checking documentation and confirming reservations, the crew immediately assumed I was wrong and demanded I accept alternative seating arrangements." She handed Martinez her boarding pass and ID. "Everything is in order. What's happening here isn't a seating dispute. It's discrimination." The word hung in the air like an explosive device with a lit fuse. Martinez examined the documents carefully. Everything appeared legitimate. Proper boarding pass, valid ID, seat assignment clearly marked 1A. But the crew's certainty, combined with David Chen's obvious comfort and authority, created a different narrative entirely. "Your documents look correct, ma'am, but airline personnel have discretion in seating assignments,
especially when it comes to passenger comfort and safety. Passenger comfort and safety. Mabel's composure cracked slightly. Whose comfort? Whose safety? The white passenger who took my seat, or the black woman trying to claim it? Officer Thompson stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice. You're creating a disturbance." The irony was suffocating. She was creating a disturbance by pointing out discrimination, while the actual discrimination was being treated as standard procedure. From the aircraft doorway, Logan Jarvis appeared, his captain's uniform lending additional authority to the situation. "Officers, I appreciate your quick response. We have a schedule to maintain, and this passenger is refusing to accept reasonable accommodations." "Captain," Mabel addressed him directly, her voice steady despite the surreal nightmare unfolding around her. "I want you to understand what's happening here. I am not refusing reasonable accommodations. I am demanding the seat I purchased and confirmed. The fact that you and your crew immediately assumed I was wrong without checking proper documentation or following standard procedures reveals a bias that—" "Ma'am," Logan interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I've been flying for Sterling Airways for 8 years. I know our procedures, and I know how to handle difficult passengers. Flight Attendant Hull is one of our most experienced crew members. If she says there's been a legitimate reassignment, then that's what happened." Difficult passengers. The phrase echoed through Mabel's mind, joining the growing collection of coded language her own employees were using to justify discriminating against her.
David Chen chose that moment to emerge from the aircraft, scotch in hand, to observe the commotion. Is this still going on? Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but I do have gold status. I was told the seat was available for upgrade. And it was, Mr. Chen, Everly assured him quickly. This passenger is just having trouble understanding our accommodation policies. Having trouble understanding, as if Mabel's 15 years of building airline policy from the ground up had left her incapable of comprehending how seat assignments worked. Martinez made his decision based on the weight of authority arrayed before him. Crew uniform, captain's stripes, gold status member, versus one woman claiming discrimination. The math wasn't complicated. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft while we sort this out." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. She was being removed from her own airline by security officers who were following the lead of her own employees. The circularity of injustice was complete. "I want this documented," Mabel said, reaching for her phone. "I want video evidence of Sterling Airways security removing a passenger with valid documentation while allowing someone else to occupy her confirmed seat." "Ma'am, put the phone away," Thompson ordered, his voice taking on an edge of authority. "Recording airport security operations is not permitted. Recording discrimination is not only permitted, it's necessary." Mabel kept her phone visible, but didn't activate the camera yet. "Officer Martinez, I want to file a formal complaint. What's happening here isn't a seating dispute. This crew made assumptions about who belongs in first class based on race, and they're using your authority to enforce those assumptions." Everly's professional mask slipped entirely. "That is absolutely not true. We treat all passengers with equal respect and professionalism. This passenger is being difficult and making false accusations to avoid accepting responsibility for her own confusion." "My confusion?" The words came out sharper than Mabel intended. "My confusion about the seat I booked, paid for, and confirmed? My confusion about company policies I helped create?" The last phrase slipped out before Mabel could stop it, and she watched Logan and Everly exchange a quick glance, the first crack in their certainty. "What do you mean, policies you helped create?" Logan asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Mabel realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could reveal her identity now, end this nightmare with a few words that would devastate every person involved, or she could let it continue, documenting the full extent of discrimination within her own company, gathering evidence that would support systematic change rather than individual punishment. She chose justice over convenience. I mean, I know Sterling Airways policy better than you apparently do, Captain Jarvis, and policy states that confirmed seat assignments take precedence over voluntary upgrades, regardless of passenger status. It was true. She'd written that policy herself, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of discrimination. Logan's face darkened. Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to lecture me about airline policy. Flight Attendant Hall, please gather this passenger's belongings. Officers, please escort her off the aircraft. Martinez nodded reluctantly. The situation had escalated beyond his comfort level, but the crew's authority seemed absolute, and the passengers' claims about discrimination felt like exactly the kind of thing difficult passengers said when they didn't get their way. Ma'am, you need to come with us. As Mabel was escorted down the jet bridge, her own employees watching her removal with satisfaction, passengers peering out aircraft windows at the commotion, she activated her phone's recording function. This is Mabel Palacios, and I am being removed from Sterling Airways Flight 447 after being denied my confirmed first-class seat. The crew refused to check proper documentation, immediately assumed I was lying about my seat assignment, and called security when I requested they follow standard airline policy. Behind her, she could hear Everly's voice rising in panic. She's recording! Officers, she can't record airport security operations. But they were no longer in the secure area. They were in the public terminal, where recording was perfectly legal. Martinez led her to a small security office near the gate, where she was asked to take a seat while they sorted everything out. Through the office window, she could see Flight 447's departure gate, where other passengers were boarding normally, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Ma'am, the crew is saying you became belligerent and refused reasonable accommodation. They're prepared to file charges for disrupting airline operations, said Martinez, settling behind a small desk.
And I'm prepared to file charges for discrimination and violation of federal anti-bias regulations, Mabel replied calmly. Officer Martinez, in your 15 years of airport security, how many first-class passengers have you removed for seating disputes? Martinez paused, clearly thinking, and of those passengers, how many were people of color who claimed their seats were given to white passengers with status privileges? The silence stretched uncomfortably. I want to speak to a supervisor, Mabel continued, and I want to speak to Sterling Airways Customer Service Management, not the crew, but corporate customer service. This incident needs to be documented at the highest levels. What Mabel didn't tell Officer Martinez was that Sterling Airways Customer Service Management ultimately reported to her. Through a chain of investment companies and holding corporations, every person who would review this incident worked for the woman they'd just discriminated against. In the corporate offices of Sterling Airways, alerts were already beginning to ping across management phones. A passenger incident requiring security intervention always triggered immediate notifications, especially when it involved first-class service and potential discrimination claims. Vice President of Operations Janet Chen received the first call at 4:47 p.m. We have a situation with Flight 447, reported Customer Service Manager Patricia Williams. First-class passenger was removed for disrupting operations. She's claiming discrimination and demanding to speak with corporate management. Routine complaint? Janet asked, already mentally filing it under problems that solve themselves. She's persistent, and she seems unusually knowledgeable about company policy. She's demanding an investigation at the highest levels. Janet sighed. The last thing Sterling Airways needed was a discrimination lawsuit, especially not with the quarterly board meeting coming up. The unknown owner was always particularly interested in customer service metrics and passenger satisfaction scores. Handle it through normal channels. Offer compensation, require non-disclosure agreement, make it disappear. What Janet didn't know was that the passenger demanding investigation was the same person who would be reviewing her performance at next week's board meeting. Back in the security office, Mabel was beginning the process that would unravel everything, starting with a simple request that would reach the desk of her own executives within the hour. I want to file a formal discrimination complaint with Sterling Airways corporate headquarters,
and I want it escalated to the highest possible level. She was about to escalate it to herself, though nobody realized it yet. When you witness injustice, do you trust the system to correct itself, or do you believe individual action is necessary for change? The owner is now officially filing a discrimination complaint against her own airline. What happens when corporate tries to cover this up, not knowing they're dealing with their boss? Subscribe to see this explosive situation unfold. At 5:23 p.m., Mabel Palacios sat in Sterling Airways Premium Customer Service office at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, watching her own employees scramble to contain a situation they didn't understand. Customer Service Manager Patricia Williams had been summoned from her dinner break, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled as she reviewed the incident report with growing alarm. "Ms. Palacios, I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. Sterling Airways prides itself on exceptional customer service, and clearly we fell short of our standards today." Misunderstanding. The word sat between them like a landmine waiting to explode. Mabel studied Patricia carefully, a woman she'd promoted to management 3 years ago based on her impressive customer satisfaction scores and innovative problem-solving approaches. She had no idea she was trying to manage the woman who'd signed off on her promotion. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Ms. Williams. This was discrimination. Your crew made assumptions about who belongs in first class based on race, then used their authority to enforce those assumptions when I challenged them." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. Most passengers accepted the misunderstanding explanation along with whatever compensation package made the problem disappear. This woman was different, articulate, knowledgeable about airline operations, and absolutely unwilling to accept corporate doublespeak. "I understand your frustration, and I want to make this right. We're prepared to offer you a full refund of your ticket price, plus a voucher for future travel and an upgrade to first class on the next available flight to Miami."
I don't want compensation. I want accountability. Mabel's voice was steady, but Patricia could hear steel underneath the calm surface. I want a formal investigation into why your crew immediately assumed I was lying about my seat assignment. I want to know why Captain Jarvis supported removing a passenger with valid documentation. And I want to understand how Sterling Airways trains its employees to handle situations involving passengers of color. Patricia felt sweat beginning to form at her hairline. This was exactly the kind of complaint that triggered federal investigations and expensive lawsuits, the kind that reached the desk of senior executives and threatened careers. Of course, we take all discrimination allegations seriously. I'll personally ensure this incident receives full investigation at the highest levels of our organization. What Patricia didn't know was that the highest level of Sterling Airways was sitting across from her, taking mental notes about how her own company handled discrimination complaints. I want that investigation to begin immediately. I want statements from every crew member involved. I want the security footage from the aircraft and gate area, and I want documentation of Sterling Airways training procedures for handling seating disputes. Patricia nodded quickly, making notes she hoped would satisfy this unusually persistent complainant. "Absolutely. Our corporate headquarters will conduct a thorough review. If you could just sign this documentation acknowledging our conversation." She slid a form across the table, standard customer service protocol that included language about amicable resolution and mutual agreement to resolve disputes through internal channels. Mabel read the form carefully, recognizing the legal language designed to prevent lawsuits and public complaints. She had reviewed similar documents in board meetings, never realizing how they felt from the receiving end. "I'm not signing anything that limits my right to pursue legal action or public disclosure. This incident needs to be addressed transparently, not buried in corporate bureaucracy." Patricia's professional mask slipped entirely. "Ms. Palacios, I'm trying to help you here. Sterling Airways is prepared to be very generous in resolving this situation, but if you refuse our good faith efforts..." The implied threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. "Are you suggesting Sterling Airways will retaliate against customers who report discrimination?" Of course not. I'm simply saying that sometimes these situations can become unnecessarily complicated when they're not handled through proper channels. Mabel leaned back in her chair, studying Patricia with new eyes. This was her employee, trained by her company, following procedures approved by her organization, procedures designed to silence discrimination complaints rather than address them. 20 minutes later, Mabel walked out of the customer service office with nothing resolved, but everything documented. Patricia Williams immediately reached for her phone, dialing the emergency number that connected directly to Sterling Airways. I need to speak with Vice President Chen immediately. We have a Code Orange situation. Code Orange, discrimination complaint with high escalation potential. In her corner office overlooking downtown Atlanta, Janet Chen received Patricia's call while reviewing quarterly performance reports. The irony was exquisite. She was literally reviewing customer satisfaction metrics when the call came in about the worst customer service failure in Sterling Airways history. "How bad is it?" Janet asked, already mentally calculating legal costs and media exposure risks. "Bad. She knows airline operations, refuses compensation, demands formal investigation, and won't sign non-disclosure agreements. She's talking about federal complaints and public disclosure." Janet's blood pressure spiked. The quarterly board meeting was 6 days away, where she'd be presenting customer service excellence to the anonymous owner who demanded perfection in every metric. What's her background? Unknown. She booked the ticket under standard procedures, no special status markers, but she talks like someone with legal experience and industry knowledge. Run a full background check immediately. Find out who we're dealing with, and get the legal team involved. We need to understand our exposure here. What Janet didn't realize was that a background check on Mabel Palacios would reveal a maze of holding companies and investment firms that ultimately led back to Sterling Airways itself. The passenger she was trying to silence owned the company she worked for. Meanwhile, back at gate B27, Flight 447 had finally departed. 47 minutes late due to the passenger incident. Everly Hall and Logan Jarvis were completing their incident reports, coordinating their stories to present the most favorable narrative possible. "She was clearly trying to scam an upgrade," Everly wrote in her official statement. "When confronted with proper procedures, she became increasingly agitated and disruptive. Safety protocols required her removal."
Logan's report was similarly damning. Passenger refused to accept crew authority and created a disturbance that threatened flight operations. Standard procedure was followed throughout. Both reports would be in the corporate headquarters within the hour, becoming part of the official record that would soon reach Mabel's own desk. But Mabel wasn't waiting for corporate machinery to grind through its processes. From her hotel room in Atlanta, she was conducting her own investigation, using resources her employees couldn't imagine. Her first call was to Marcus Thompson, Sterling Airways Director of Security, a man she'd hired personally, but who knew her only as a mysterious board member who asked penetrating questions about operational security. "Marcus, this is Mabel Palacios. I need you to pull security footage for Flight 447 this afternoon, Gate B27, aircraft interior, and all related areas." "Of course, Miss Palacios. Any particular reason?" "Passenger incident that requires board-level review. I want complete documentation before anyone has a chance to edit or delete anything." Marcus knew better than question board-level requests. Within 30 minutes, comprehensive security footage was secured and copied to multiple servers. Her second call was to the legal firm Sterling Airways kept on retainer, lawyers who had no idea their ultimate client was the woman they were about to help investigate. "This is Mabel Palacios calling on behalf of Sterling Airways Board. We have a potential discrimination incident that requires immediate legal review." The law firm that handled Sterling Airways' most sensitive matters snapped into action, assembling a team to investigate what they assumed was a routine passenger complaint requiring careful damage control. Her third call was to Dr. Sarah Kim, the diversity consultant Sterling Airways contracted for sensitivity training that apparently had failed spectacularly. Dr. Kim, I need you to review Sterling Airways' current anti-discrimination protocols and crew training procedures. We may have a significant issue. By 8 p.m., Mabel had set in motion an investigation into her own company using her own resources, directed by her own authority, while her executives scrambled to contain a situation they couldn't begin to understand. The most delicious irony was still to come. Every report, every legal brief, every investigation summary would ultimately land on her desk for final review, since she was the board authority who'd ordered the investigation in the first place. In Sterling Airways corporate headquarters, emergency meetings were being called. Janet Chen convened her crisis management team, including legal counsel David Morrison, public relations director Lisa Park, and human resources vice president Michael Zhang. We have a passenger making serious discrimination allegations. She refused standard compensation and is demanding formal investigation. Legal says we need to take this seriously. How seriously? Asked Morrison. Federal complaint seriously, public relations nightmare seriously, quarterly board meeting disaster seriously. Lisa Park's face went pale. If this hits social media before we control the narrative. It won't, Janet said firmly. We contain it, we investigate it internally, and we make it disappear. The board doesn't need to know about routine operational issues unless they become actual legal problems. The ultimate irony? Sterling Airways executives were planning to hide a discrimination incident from the board, not knowing the discriminated passenger was the board's ultimate authority. Michael Zhang raised the obvious question. What if the investigation reveals actual discrimination? Then we handle it appropriately, disciplinary action, additional training, policy adjustments, but we do it quietly, internally, and completely. What none of them realized was that their quiet, internal, complete handling of discrimination was exactly the systematic bias Mabel had built Sterling Airways to eliminate. As midnight approached, two parallel investigations were beginning. Sterling Airways executives trying to minimize and contain a discrimination complaint, and Sterling Airways owner building an airtight case against her own company. The collision was inevitable. The explosion would be spectacular. But the most devastating moment was still ahead, when Sterling Airways leadership realized they'd been trying to silence and intimidate the person who could destroy all their careers with a single email. How do corporate systems designed to handle discrimination complaints actually perpetuate the very bias they claim to address? The owner is now investigating her own company while executives plot to silence her. What happens when these two investigations collide? Hit subscribe to witness the most explosive corporate scandal in aviation history.
The background check results arrived on Janet Chen's desk at 9:47 a.m. the next morning, and they made her blood run cold. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, staring at the report that had cost Sterling Airways $3,000 in expedited private investigation fees. The passenger they were trying to silence, Mabel Palacios, was connected to a maze of holding companies and investment firms that seemed designed to obscure rather than reveal. David Morrison, Sterling Airways legal counsel, leaned over her shoulder to read the report. Palomar Holdings, Meridian Investment Group, Atlantic Strategic Partners, these are shell companies, professional-grade financial privacy structures. What kind of passenger has shell companies? The kind that can afford very expensive lawyers, Morrison replied grimly. Janet, we might be dealing with someone who has serious financial resources and legal sophistication. What neither of them realized was that the shell companies were designed to hide the fact that Mabel Palacios owned Sterling Airways itself. The background check had revealed the tip of an iceberg that would sink their careers if they ever discovered what lay beneath the surface. Meanwhile, at the Ritz-Carlton Atlanta, Mabel was reviewing her own investigation results over morning coffee. The picture emerging was worse than she'd feared. Dr. Sarah Kim's preliminary report on Sterling Airways diversity training sat open on her laptop screen, and every paragraph revealed systematic failures in the culture Mabel had tried so hard to build. Current training protocols focus primarily on legal compliance rather than cultural transformation, Dr. Kim had written. Crew members receive minimal instruction on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. The training materials reviewed contain language that could actually reinforce discriminatory assumptions rather than challenge them. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she read further. Interview subjects consistently referenced maintaining standards and protecting premium customer experience in ways that correlate with exclusionary practices against passengers of color. Her own company had institutionalized the very bias she'd founded Sterling Airways to eliminate. The security footage Marcus Thompson had provided was even more damning. Mabel watched herself being discriminated against from multiple camera angles, seeing clearly how Everly Hall's body language and tone had shifted the moment she saw a black woman claiming first-class privileges. But the most devastating discovery came from the legal team's investigation into similar incidents. At 10:15 a.m., Mabel's phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, the senior partner at Morrison & Associates, the law firm Sterling Airways kept on retainer. Ms. Palacios, I've been asked to conduct a comprehensive review of this incident on behalf of Sterling Airways Board of Directors. I want you to know we're taking your allegations very seriously. I appreciate that. What have you discovered? Jennifer's voice took on the careful tone lawyers used when delivering bad news. We've identified a pattern of concerning incidents involving passengers of color on flights where Ms. Hull served as lead flight attendant. 7 formal complaints in the past 18 months, all involving seating disputes or service degradation in first-class sections. Mabel's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. 7 complaints? 7 people who had experienced what she experienced, but without her resources or authority to demand justice. Were these complaints resolved? All were settled through standard customer service protocols, compensation packages with non-disclosure agreements. No formal disciplinary action was taken against crew members. The systematic nature of the cover-up crystallized in Mabel's mind. Sterling Airways hadn't just failed to prevent discrimination, it had created a system to hide and perpetuate it. Miss Walsh, I need names and contact information for those other complainants. I'm sorry, but confidentiality agreements prevent. Those agreements are void if they were used to conceal ongoing discrimination. As a passenger who experienced similar treatment, I have standing to challenge the legal validity of those non-disclosure clauses.
Jennifer Walsh paused, clearly recognizing she was dealing with someone who understood legal strategy better than most passengers should. I'll need to consult with Sterling Airways executives about that request. Please do. And tell them I'm also requesting complete personnel files for all crew members involved in yesterday's incident, as well as training records and performance evaluations. After ending the call, Mabel sat in her hotel room, staring out at the Atlantis skyline where Sterling Airways headquarters gleamed in the morning sun. Her company, her legacy, was systematically discriminating against people who looked like her, then silencing them with corporate settlements. The revelation demanded action beyond personal justice. This was about institutional accountability. At Sterling Airways headquarters, emergency meetings proliferated like cancer cells. Janet Chen had convened what she euphemistically called a strategic response team, but what everyone recognized as a crisis management war room. The passenger knows about the other complaints, Jennifer Walsh reported via speakerphone from her downtown law office. She's demanding contact information for previous complainants and requesting personnel files for crew members. She's also challenging the legal validity of our non-disclosure agreements. Human Resources VP Michael Zhang's face went pale. If those NDAs are invalidated, we're looking at potential class action exposure. How many total incidents are we talking about? Asked Public Relations Director Lisa Park. Michael consulted his tablet. 17 formal complaints involving crew bias in the past 3 years. 43 informal complaints that were resolved through standard customer service protocols. The numbers hit the room like a physical blow. 60 complaints over 3 years, an average of 20 incidents annually where passengers felt discriminated against by Sterling Airways crew members. "Jesus Christ," Janet whispered. "How did we not see this pattern? We did see it, we just categorized it as routine customer service issues rather than systematic discrimination. Each incident was handled individually, so nobody connected the dots." Lisa Park was already calculating media exposure scenarios. If this becomes public, we're not just dealing with one discrimination incident. We're looking at exposure of a systematic pattern of bias that was officially covered up by corporate policy. The irony was exquisite. Sterling Airways executives were finally recognizing the systematic discrimination within their company, not because they had developed moral clarity, but because they were afraid of being sued by their own owner. Meanwhile, Mabel was expanding her investigation beyond Sterling Airways. She'd contacted Marcus Johnson, a civil rights attorney who specialized in transportation discrimination, and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. "Ms. Palacios, I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided. This appears to be a textbook case of institutional discrimination masked as customer service discretion. What's the legal exposure for Sterling Airways?" "Significant. Federal transportation anti-discrimination regulations, civil rights violations, and potentially criminal charges if we can prove deliberate conspiracy to deprive passengers of their civil rights." He leaned forward intensely. "But more importantly, this could force systematic change across the entire industry." Mabel nodded, recognizing that her personal humiliation could become a catalyst for industry-wide reform. "I want to file formal complaints with the Department of Transportation, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the Federal Aviation Administration. I want this investigated at the federal level." "That's aggressive," Marcus noted. "Most passengers settle these disputes privately." "I'm not most passengers." At 2:47 p.m., federal complaint forms were submitted simultaneously to 3 government agencies, triggering automatic investigation protocols that would soon bring federal investigators to Sterling Airways headquarters. By 4 p.m., social media was beginning to buzz. Someone had recorded video of Mabel being escorted off Flight 447, and the footage was starting to circulate on Twitter and TikTok with hashtags like #Sterling Airways Discrimination and #FirstClassWhileBlack.
The video showed exactly what Janet Chen had feared, a well-dressed black woman being removed from an aircraft while a white passenger remained comfortably in the disputed seat. Even without context, the optics were devastating. Lisa Park burst into Janet's office with her phone in hand. "We have a problem. The incident is going viral." Janet watched the video with growing horror. From this angle, with social media's brutal simplicity, Sterling Airways looked like a company that removed black passengers to accommodate white customers. The complexity of crew procedures and passenger status programs disappeared into the visual narrative of obvious discrimination. How many views? 50,000 in the past hour, and climbing. The video had been posted by @JusticeWatchATL, an account dedicated to documenting discrimination incidents. The caption read, "Sterling Airways removes black woman from first-class seat she paid for, allows white passenger to remain. This is what systemic racism looks like.
#Justice for Mabel. Janet's phone started ringing immediately. Local news stations, national media outlets, civil rights organizations, everyone's response to the viral discrimination video. "We need a statement," Lisa urged. "Now." "What do we say? That we followed proper procedures? That looks terrible against the video evidence." "We say we're investigating and committed to fair treatment of all passengers." While our actual passenger is filing federal complaints and demanding systematic change? The walls were closing in from every direction. Federal investigations, viral social media, legal exposure, and a mysteriously sophisticated complainant who refused to be silenced or bought off. In her hotel room, Mabel watched the social media explosion with mixed emotions. The viral video was generating exactly the public pressure needed to force accountability, but she also recognized that her employees, her responsibility, were about to face consequences they never anticipated. Everly Hull and Logan Jarvis had acted according to training and culture she ultimately created. Their discrimination was real and unacceptable, but it was also systematic, a product of institutional failures that went far beyond individual prejudice. At 6 p.m., Mabel made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and called Janet Chen directly. "Miss Chen, this is Mabel Palacios. I believe we need to talk." When discrimination becomes systematic and institutional, how do we balance individual accountability with organizational responsibility? Federal investigations, viral videos, and systematic corruption exposed. But the owner is about to make direct contact with her executives. What happens when she finally reveals who she really is? Subscribe now for the most explosive confrontation in corporate history. Janet Chen's hand trembled slightly as she answered the phone call that would change everything. She'd been expecting angry media inquiries, legal threats, or federal investigators, not a direct call from the passenger who was single-handedly dismantling Sterling Airways' reputation. "Miss Palacios," Janet said, trying to project calm authority while her pulse hammered against her throat. "I'm glad you called. I've been hoping we could resolve this situation amicably." "Have you been watching the news, Miss Chen?" Janet glanced at the wall-mounted television in her office, where CNN was running a segment titled "Discrimination at 30,000 Feet," with the viral video of Mabel's removal playing on loop. The chyron read, "Sterling Airways under federal investigation for racial bias." "I'm aware of the media attention, yes. I want you to know that Sterling Airways takes these allegations very seriously." "Allegations?" Mabel's voice cut through the corporate speak like a blade. "Miss Chen, I have security footage, witness statements, crew incident reports, and documentation of 60 similar complaints over the past 3 years. These aren't allegations. These are facts." The casual mention of 60 complaints made Janet's blood run cold. That number was supposed to be confidential, buried in internal HR files. How did this passenger have access to information that should have been protected by the attorney-client privilege? "I'm not sure where you're getting those numbers." "I'm getting them from Sterling Airways' own legal team, diversity consultants, and security department, all of whom are cooperating fully with my investigation."
Janet felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't a routine passenger complaint anymore. This woman had somehow gained access to Sterling Airways' internal resources and was using them to build a systematic case against the company. "Miss Palacios, who exactly are you?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Mabel answered. "I'm someone who cares deeply about Sterling Airways' reputation and future. Someone who's invested significant time and resources in building this company into something that represents excellence without bias." The phrasing was oddly specific, not someone who cares about justice or fairness, but someone personally invested in Sterling Airways itself. "I'd like to meet with you," Janet said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. "Face to face, tomorrow morning if possible." "That's acceptable, but not at Sterling Airways headquarters. Neutral territory. The Ritz-Carlton downtown executive conference room, 9 a.m. After Mabel hung up, Janet stared at her phone, trying to process what had just happened. A discrimination complainant didn't typically demand neutral territory for settlement negotiations. She talked like someone accustomed to corporate power dynamics, someone who understood leverage and strategic positioning. Janet immediately called an emergency meeting with her crisis management team. She has internal information that should be confidential, Janet reported to the assembled executives 30 minutes later. She knows about the 60 complaints. She's somehow accessing our legal team and security resources, and she's demanding a face-to-face meeting on neutral territory. Legal counsel David Morrison looked pale. That's impossible. Our legal files are privileged. Only senior management and board-level authority could access that information. Board-level authority? Janet repeated slowly. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sterling Airways' board structure was intentionally opaque, with the ultimate ownership hidden behind layers of investment firms and holding companies. Even senior executives like Janet had never met the anonymous owner who controlled the company through proxy voting and strategic directives. "You don't think—" Michael Zhang began, then stopped himself. "Think what?" Lisa Park demanded. "Nothing. It's impossible. The board member we work with is—" "Is what, Michael?" "Is Mabel Palacios." The silence that followed was deafening. Janet felt her world tilt on its axis. That can't be right. "Check the board communications," David Morrison said urgently, pulling out his laptop. "The mysterious board member who asks penetrating questions about operational security, demands detailed customer service metrics, reviews diversity initiatives." He scrolled through months of encrypted board communications, reading names that suddenly seemed significant in a entirely new context. "Oh, God," he whispered. "The security footage request yesterday, the legal team mobilization, the diversity consultant investigation, they all came from board-level authority signed M. Palacios." Janet's legs gave out, and she sank into her chair as the full scope of the disaster became clear. They hadn't just discriminated against a passenger, they had discriminated against their owner. The person who controlled their budgets, their policies, their careers, their very existence as a company. "We removed the owner of Sterling Airways from her own aircraft," Lisa Park said, her voice barely audible. "We had her escorted off by security, tried to silence her with NDAs, and planned to hide the incident from the board, which is her." Meanwhile, in her hotel suite, Mabel was conducting her own evening briefing with the team she'd assembled. Civil rights attorney Marcus Johnson, joined by video conference, along with Dr. Sarah Kim and investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez, who'd been documenting corporate discrimination patterns for the Washington Post. "The federal investigations are proceeding rapidly," Marcus reported. "DOT has assigned a senior compliance team. DOJ's Civil Rights Division is treating this as a pattern and practice investigation. FAA is reviewing Sterling Airways safety culture protocols." "What's the legal exposure?" Mabel asked. "Potentially catastrophic. Federal transportation discrimination carries civil penalties up to $27,000 per incident. With 60 documented complaints, we're looking at potential fines in excess of $1.6 million. Plus, civil rights violations, systematic pattern penalties, and individual lawsuit exposure."
Dr. Kim's report was equally damning. The training materials review reveals institutional bias embedded in company culture. Phrases like maintaining standards and protecting premium experience are consistently coded language for exclusionary practices. Rebecca Martinez had been investigating corporate discrimination for 5 years, but she'd never seen anything this systematic. Mabel, this isn't just a Sterling Airways story. This is about how the entire airline industry uses customer service discretion to perpetuate segregation in premium seating. Which is exactly why it needs to be exposed completely, Mabel replied. Half measures won't change institutional culture. The next morning, Janet Chen arrived at the Ritz-Carlton Executive Conference Room 15 minutes early, accompanied by David Morrison and an external legal consultant who specialized in corporate crisis management. She'd barely slept, spending the night reviewing every interaction with board member Mabel Palacios over the past 3 years. The communications painted a picture of someone deeply invested in Sterling Airways' success, someone who asked probing questions about operational efficiency and employee satisfaction, someone who demanded excellence in customer service metrics, someone who had built the company culture that her employees had just violated in the most public way possible. At exactly 9 a.m., Mabel Palacios walked into the conference room. Janet's first thought was how ordinary she looked, a well-dressed black woman in a tailored business suit, carrying herself with quiet confidence. Nothing about her appearance suggested corporate authority or financial power. She looked exactly like someone Everly Hull would assume didn't belong in first class. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming," Mabel said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "I believe we have significant matters to discuss." Janet shook hands while studying Mabel's face, looking for some sign of the authority she'd come to recognize in board communications. What she saw was intelligence, composure, and something that might have been disappointment. "Miss Chen, before we begin, I need to ask directly, are you connected to Sterling Airways' board of directors?" Mabel took her seat across the conference table, arranging her materials with precise efficiency. "I'm connected to Sterling Airways in ways that go far deeper than board oversight, Miss Chen. I created this company 15 years ago with a vision of excellence that transcended the biases that plague this industry." The admission hit Janet like a physical blow, but Mabel wasn't finished. "I built Sterling Airways to prove that an airline could succeed by serving everyone with dignity and respect. I chose the company name to represent something sterling, precious, valuable, uncompromising in quality. I designed those first-class seats myself, chose those leather colors, approved every detail of the cabin layouts." Janet's legal consultant was taking frantic notes, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with someone far beyond their initial assessment. "Yesterday, I boarded my own aircraft and was treated exactly like 60 other passengers have been treated over the past 3 years, with suspicion, condescension, and systematic discrimination that my own employees have been trained to deliver." Mabel opened a folder containing security photographs, crew incident reports, and legal documentation. "This isn't about one passenger complaint, Miss Chen. This is about discovering that the company I created to eliminate bias has instead institutionalized it. Your crew didn't discriminate against Mabel Palacios' passenger. They discriminated against Mabel Palacios, owner. And they did it using policies and training that I ultimately approved." The conference room fell into stunned silence. Janet Chen, who had spent 15 years climbing Sterling Airways' corporate ladder, was face-to-face with the person who had built every rung of that ladder. "The question now," Mabel continued, "is whether Sterling Airways can be transformed into the company I originally envisioned, or whether it needs to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up." David Morrison found his voice first. "Miss Palacios, what do you want from us?" Mabel's smile was sharp as winter air. "I want justice, Mr. Morrison, not just for myself, but for every passenger who was silenced by your non-disclosure agreements. I want accountability for every employee who perpetuated discrimination while believing they were protecting company standards.
And I want systematic change that ensures this never happens to anyone again." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the authority Janet had learned to recognize in board communications. "But the most important thing, I want Sterling Airways to become the company I originally built it to be. And that's going to require some very significant changes in leadership, culture, and accountability. When leaders discover their own organizations have failed their foundational values, is reform possible, or does transformation require complete rebuilding? The owner has revealed herself to her executives. Their world is collapsing as they realize who they've been fighting. But the ultimate confrontation with the crew is still coming. Subscribe to see the most explosive corporate revelation in history.
The Sterling Airways crew lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport felt smaller than usual as Everly Hall sat across from Logan Jarvis, both of them staring at their phones in stunned silence. The viral video had reached 2 million views overnight, and their names were trending on Twitter alongside hashtags they'd never wanted to see. Hashtag EverlyD discrimination and hashtag pilot bias. "This is insane," Logan muttered, scrolling through comments that ranged from supportive to absolutely vicious. "We followed standard procedure. We did everything by the book." Everly's hands shook slightly as she read a particularly damning thread analyzing her body language frame by frame. "Look at how her whole demeanor changes when she sees the black woman," one comment read. "Classic racist microaggressions masked as professionalism." "The company will back us up," Everly said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They have to. We were doing our jobs." Neither of them had slept. Sterling Airways management had placed them on administrative leave pending the federal investigation, which meant they were stuck in limbo, too visible to work, too implicated to hide. Their union representatives had advised complete silence, but the silence felt like an admission of guilt. Logan's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "The neighbors are asking questions. Kids are getting harassed at school. How much worse is this going to get?" Before he could answer, their phones simultaneously chimed with an urgent message from Sterling Airways Human Resources. "Report to Executive Conference Room A immediately. Mandatory meeting regarding Flight 447 incident." They walked through Sterling Airways headquarters like condemned prisoners heading to execution. Other employees averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands. Security badges that had once granted them respect now felt like scarlet letters marking them as the crew who'd sparked a national discrimination scandal. Executive Conference Room A was Sterling Airways' most formal meeting space, reserved for board presentations in crisis management. When Everly and Logan entered, they found a scene that made their blood run cold. Seated around the polished mahogany table were Janet Chen, legal counsel David Morrison, HR Director Michael Zhang, and two people they didn't recognize, a black woman in an expensive business suit and a man with the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement. "Please sit down," Janet said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "We need to discuss your involvement in yesterday's incident." Logan and Everly took seats at the far end of the table, suddenly aware that this wasn't a supportive meeting with management. This felt like an interrogation. "Before we begin," Janet continued, "I want you to meet Special Agent Williams from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and—" she paused, as if the next introduction was physically painful. "Miss Mabel Palacios." The name hit them like a physical blow. The passenger, the woman they'd removed from the aircraft, the woman they'd assumed was lying about her seat assignment, the person they'd had escorted off their aircraft, owned the entire company. That's not possible," Everly whispered. "Miss Hall," Mabel's voice carried 15 years of quiet authority. "I built this airline from nothing. I chose your uniform design. I approved your hiring. I signed the paychecks that have supported your family for 12 years. And yesterday, you treated me exactly like 60 other passengers of color have been treated on flights under your supervision." Logan's world tilted on its axis. Every assumption he'd made, every justification he'd constructed, every moment of certainty about following proper procedure, all of it crumbled into dust.
"I designed the first-class cabin you removed me from. I wrote the customer service policies you claimed to be following. I created the training programs that apparently taught you to see black women as threats to premium service standards. Special Agent Williams opened a folder containing security footage screenshots. Ms. Hull, in your incident report, you stated that Ms. Palacios became increasingly agitated and disruptive. Can you explain why that characterization doesn't match any of the security footage we've reviewed? Everly stared at the photos, showing her own face twisted with dismissive contempt, while Mabel stood calmly holding her boarding pass. The contrast was devastating. A professional black woman being treated with obvious bias by a flight attendant whose prejudices were written clearly across her features. I was following standard procedures for seating disputes, Everly managed. Whose standard procedures? Mabel asked quietly. Because the procedures I approved for Sterling Airways require crew members to verify documentation before making seating changes. They require respectful treatment of all passengers regardless of appearance. They specifically prohibit assumptions about passenger status based on race or gender. She slid a document across the table, Sterling Airways' official customer service manual with relevant sections highlighted. These are the procedures you were supposed to follow, Ms. Hull. The procedures I wrote specifically to prevent exactly what you did to me. Logan tried to salvage something from the wreckage. Ma'am, Miss Palacios, we had no way of knowing... Knowing what, Captain Jarvis? That I owned the company? You had no way of knowing I was human? You had no way of knowing I deserved basic respect? You had no way of knowing that a black woman might legitimately belong in first class? The questions hit like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of justification. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? You both looked at me and decided I didn't belong. Not because of my documentation, you barely glanced at my boarding pass. Not because of my behavior, I was calmer than most passengers would be in that situation. You decided I didn't belong because I'm a black woman, and in your minds, black women don't get to sit in first class without explanation, without validation, without proving themselves worthy of space you assume belongs to someone else. Everly's professional composure finally cracked. That's not fair. We treat all passengers with respect. Do you? Mabel opened another folder, this one containing a thick stack of complaint forms. 7 formal discrimination complaints in 18 months, Ms. Hull. All passengers of color. All on flights where you were the lead flight attendant. All resolved through corporate settlements and non-disclosure agreements. She spread the complaint forms across the table like tarot cards, revealing a terrible future. Marcus Williams, October 2022, denied first-class service despite a valid ticket. Tanya Rodriguez, January 2023, asked to prove she belonged in her assigned seat. David Thompson, March 2023, told his upgrade was a mistake that needed correction. Each name landed with devastating impact, building a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as a coincidence or a misunderstanding. And Captain Jarvis, your incident reports consistently supported these discriminatory actions. Every single time, you backed up Ms. Hull's assessment that black passengers were disruptive or confused about their seating assignments. Logan stared at the forms, watching his career dissolve in real time. I trusted my flight attendant's judgment. Your trusted judgment that consistently concluded black passengers were lying about their seat assignments? Your trusted judgment that always assumed passengers of color were trying to scam upgrades? Special Agent Williams leaned forward. Ms. Hull, Captain Jarvis, you're both aware that these incidents constitute a pattern of discrimination that violates federal civil rights laws. The legal reality crashed over them like cold water. This wasn't just about Sterling Airways policy or corporate discipline. They were facing federal charges, career destruction, and personal liability that could bankrupt their families. "What do you want from us?" Logan asked, his voice barely audible. Mabel studied them both for a long moment, these two people who had humiliated her, who had treated her like a criminal, who had represented everything she'd built Sterling Airways to overcome. I want you to understand that your actions didn't just harm me, Captain. They harmed every passenger of color who flies Sterling Airways, because they know that crew prejudice is protected by corporate policy. They harmed every black child who dreams of success but learns that success doesn't protect them from discrimination. They harmed the company I built to prove that excellence and equality could coexist." She stood up, her authority filling the room.
But mostly, I want you to understand that the person you treated as unworthy of basic human dignity was the person whose vision, whose investment, whose leadership created every opportunity you've had in your careers. You discriminated against the person who built the company that gave you purpose, who trusted you with responsibility, who believed you would represent the values Sterling Airways was founded. The meeting ended in devastated silence. Logan Jarvis and Everly Hall walked out of Sterling Airways headquarters knowing their careers were over, knowing they faced federal charges, knowing that their names would forever be associated with one of corporate America's most explosive discrimination scandals. But the worst part wasn't the legal exposure or career destruction. The worst part was knowing they had betrayed the trust of someone who had believed in them, who had given them opportunities, who had built something beautiful that they had corrupted through their own prejudice and willful blindness. They had discriminated against their benefactor, and there was no redemption possible from that level of betrayal. When prejudice is revealed as a betrayal of trust, how do we process the difference between ignorance and willful discrimination? The crew has been confronted with the devastating truth of their betrayal, but can there be redemption? Or is justice sometimes about consequences? Subscribe to see how this explosive confrontation resolves. The Sterling Airways corporate boardroom had never felt smaller. Mabel Palacios sat at the head of the mahogany table she'd chosen 15 years earlier, facing the executives who'd spent the past 48 hours trying to silence her. The irony was suffocating. She was conducting a disciplinary hearing in her own boardroom against her own employees for discriminating against herself. Janet Chen looked like she'd aged a decade since their meeting at the Ritz-Carlton. Her usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged documents that suddenly meant nothing. Across from her, legal counsel David Morrison stared at his laptop screen, watching their legal strategy collapse in real time as federal investigators requested additional documentation. "The DOT investigation has expanded," David reported, his voice hollow. "They want 5 years of passenger complaint records, all crew training materials, and complete personnel files for any employee involved in discrimination incidents." "How many employees is that?" Mabel asked, though she already knew the answer. 47 crew members across 12 different incidents, Human Resources VP Michael Zhang replied. "If the federal penalties apply to each incident, we're looking at over $2.3 million in fines." Mabel nodded calmly. The money meant nothing to her. It was her money anyway. What mattered was the systematic change these investigations would force across the entire industry. "What about media exposure?" she asked. Public Relations Director Lisa Park looked ready to cry. "CNN is running a special segment tonight, Discrimination in the Skies, the Sterling Airways Scandal. The Washington Post is publishing a comprehensive investigation tomorrow, and the viral video has been viewed 8 million times. 8 million people had watched Mabel being removed from her own aircraft by her own employees. The visual was devastating. A black woman treated as unworthy of first-class treatment, while a white passenger remained comfortable in her seat. Most damaging, Lisa continued, is that other passengers from those 60 incidents are coming forward. The NDAs are being challenged in court, and victims are sharing their stories publicly. We're facing a class action lawsuit representing hundreds of passengers who claim systematic discrimination." Mabel felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice was being served, but at the cost of destroying the company she had built with such hope. "There's something else," Janet said quietly. "Everly Hall and Logan Jarvis want to speak with you directly." The request surprised Mabel.
After learning her true identity, most employees had avoided any contact, terrified of facing the person they discriminated against, who also controlled their professional futures. They want to apologize. They want to understand, Michael Zhang said carefully. Hull has been with the company 12 years, Jarvis 8 years. They both built their careers here, and they're struggling to process that their training and culture led them to discriminate against the owner of the company. Mabel considered the request. She could easily fire both employees, let the federal investigations run their course, and rebuild Sterling Airways from the executive level down. It would be clean, efficient, and completely justified. But it wouldn't address the deeper question. How had her vision of an egalitarian airline become a system that institutionalized the very discrimination she'd sought to eliminate?
Schedule the meeting, she decided. Conference room B, 1 hour. When Everly Hull walked into the conference room, her usual confidence had evaporated entirely. The woman who'd authoritatively removed a disruptive passenger 2 days earlier now moved with the tentative steps of someone walking through a minefield. Logan Jarvis followed. His captain's uniform somehow diminished, the authority it represented revealed as borrowed rather than inherent. They took seats across from Mabel, and the silence stretched uncomfortably before Everly found her voice. "Miss Palacios, I don't know how to begin." "Begin with honesty," Mabel replied. "Tell me what you were thinking when you decided I didn't belong in first class." Everly's professional mask, so carefully maintained for 12 years, cracked completely. "I thought you were trying to scam an upgrade. I thought you were lying about your ticket. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought you looked like trouble." "Why?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. "Because—" Everly struggled with words she'd never had to examine before. "Because in 12 years of flying, the passengers who caused problems in first class, who argued about seats, who seemed out of place, they usually looked like you." The admission was devastating in its honesty. Logan Jarvis leaned forward, his pilot's training compelling him to provide supporting evidence. "Our crew reports consistently identified certain passenger profiles as higher risk for disruption. Young black passengers, passengers with casual dress in premium cabins, passengers who seemed unfamiliar with first-class protocols." "And you believed these profiles were accurate?" "We believed they protected our other passengers' experience," Logan said. "We thought we were maintaining service standards." Mabel nodded slowly, recognizing the insidious way bias had become policy, discrimination had become procedure, and exclusion had become excellence. "Everly, in 12 years, how many black passengers have you served in first class?" Everly thought carefully, clearly trying to provide an honest answer. "Maybe 40? 50? And how many of those did you treat with immediate suspicion?" The silence was answer enough. "Logan, as captain, how many times have you supported your crew's decision to remove passengers from first class?" 7 times in 8 years. "How many of those passengers were people of color?" Logan's face went pale. "All of them." The pattern was undeniable. The institutional nature of the discrimination was clear, but Mabel saw something in their faces that gave her hope. Genuine horror at recognizing their own bias, real remorse for the harm they'd caused, an authentic commitment to change. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked. "We discriminated against our boss," Everly said quietly. "No, you discriminated against a human being who deserved basic dignity and respect.
The fact that I own this company makes it ironic, but it doesn't make it worse. Every passenger you've treated this way deserved better regardless of their relationship to Sterling Airways." Tears were streaming down Everly's face now. "I've destroyed people's travel experiences. I've made passengers feel unwelcome in their own seats. I've become everything I thought I was protecting against." Logan nodded heavily. "We thought we were maintaining standards, but we were enforcing segregation. We thought we were protecting service quality, but we were perpetuating discrimination." Mabel studied both employees carefully. She could see genuine remorse, real recognition of their failures, and authentic commitment to change. The question was whether that recognition could translate into systematic transformation. "What do you think should happen to you?" she asked. Everly looked up, meeting Mabel's eyes directly for the first time. "We should be fired. We discriminated against passengers, violated federal law, and humiliated Sterling Airways. We deserve to lose our jobs."
And if I don't fire you? Then we spend every day proving we've learned from this. We become the advocates we should have been from the beginning. We help rebuild Sterling Airways into the company you originally envisioned. Logan nodded in agreement. We use our experience, our knowledge of how discrimination operates in airline culture to help create systematic change that prevents this from happening to anyone else. Mabel leaned back in her chair, considering her options. She could fire them. It would satisfy public outrage, send a clear message about accountability, and remove the specific individuals who discriminated against her. Or she could transform them into agents of change, using their intimate knowledge of airline bias to create training programs, policy reforms, and cultural shifts that would have industry-wide impact. Everly, if you stay with Sterling Airways, you'll face federal investigation, media scrutiny, and constant public recognition as someone who discriminated against passengers. Your career will be forever defined by this incident. I understand. Logan, you'll lose your captain status pending retraining and certification in anti-discrimination protocols. You'll face Federal Aviation Authority review and possible license restrictions. I accept that. And both of you will work directly with our new Chief Diversity Officer to redesign Sterling Airways training programs, passenger interaction protocols, and crew culture standards. Everly looked up with something that might have been hope. You're not firing us? I'm giving you the chance to fix what you broke. But understand, this isn't forgiveness. This is an opportunity to earn redemption through systematic change that benefits every future passenger who might otherwise face what I faced. Mabel stood, her decision made. You have one chance to transform Sterling Airways from a company that perpetuates discrimination into a company that eliminates it. Don't waste it. As they left the conference room, both employees understood that their careers, their reputations, and their professional future now depended on their ability to become the opposite of everything they had been. The choice had been made. Now came the transformation. When people recognize their own bias and express genuine remorse, is redemption through systematic change more valuable than punishment through termination? The owner has chosen redemption over revenge. But can people who perpetuated discrimination truly become agents of change? Subscribe to see the final transformation in this incredible justice story. 6 months later, Mabel Palacios stood at the podium of the International Aviation Diversity Summit in Washington, D.C., facing an audience of airline executives, federal regulators, and civil rights advocates. The woman who had been discriminated on her own aircraft was now leading industry-wide transformation that would reshape commercial aviation forever.
"When I boarded Sterling Airways Flight 447 6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had turned personal humiliation into systematic justice, "I discovered that the company I built to eliminate bias instead institutionalized it. Today, I'm here to share how that devastating discovery became a blueprint for change across our entire industry." The audience, including Transportation Secretary Maria Rodriguez and DOT Civil Rights Director James Washington, listened intently as Mabel outlined the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from her discrimination case. Sterling Airways has implemented what we call the Dignity in Travel initiative. Every crew member now receives 40 hours of anti-bias training annually. Every passenger interaction is reviewed for discriminatory patterns, and every complaint is investigated by an independent civil rights panel with full authority to recommend personnel changes. Behind her, a presentation screen showed the dramatic statistics. Discrimination complaints at Sterling Airways had dropped by 94% in 6 months. Customer satisfaction among passengers of color had increased by 67%. Employee cultural competency scores had risen from 3.2 to 8.7 out of 10. But the most significant change was structural. Sterling Airways had hired Dr. Sarah Kim as Chief Diversity Officer with executive authority equal to the CEO. Every policy decision now requires a diversity impact assessment. Every route planning meeting included a discussion of equitable service delivery. The transformation required acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Discrimination in aviation isn't about individual prejudice. It's about systematic bias embedded in training, policies, and corporate culture. Individual accountability is important, but institutional change is essential. In the audience, Everly Hall and Logan Jarvis sat together, wearing new Sterling Airways uniforms with special insignia identifying them as diversity advocates. Their transformation had been remarkable and painful. Both had faced federal investigation, public scrutiny, and intense retraining. But they had also become the most effective anti-discrimination trainers in Sterling Airways history.
Everly now led sensitivity sessions where she shared her own story of unconscious bias, helping other crew members recognize the assumptions that led to discriminatory behavior. Her honesty about her own failures made her credible in ways that external consultants could never match. Logan had developed new pilot protocols that required captains to intervene if they observed discriminatory passenger treatment. His intimate knowledge of how authority structures enabled discrimination made him uniquely qualified to redesign those systems. The individuals who discriminated against me are now leading our anti-discrimination efforts, Mabel explained to the summit audience. They understand bias from the inside because they lived it. Their transformation demonstrates that people can change, and their expertise helps prevent others from making the same mistakes. But the impact extended far beyond Sterling Airways. The federal investigations triggered by Mabel's case had revealed systematic discrimination patterns across multiple airlines. The Department of Transportation had imposed new industry-wide regulations requiring bias training, discrimination reporting, and passenger advocacy systems. American Airlines had settled a class action lawsuit representing 347 passengers who experienced similar discrimination. Delta had implemented new oversight protocols after federal investigators found patterns of premium cabin exclusion. United had hired an external civil rights firm to audit its passenger treatment procedures. The economic impact was substantial. Airlines faced over $15 million in federal fines, civil lawsuit settlements, and mandatory compliance costs. But the cultural impact was immeasurable. 6 months ago,
passengers of color routinely faced assumptions that they didn't belong in premium cabins, Mabel told the summit. Today, those same passengers report feeling welcomed and valued. The industry has learned that genuine hospitality requires genuine inclusion. The personal stories were the most powerful evidence of change. Maria Santos, one of the original 60 discrimination victims whose case had been silenced by NDAs, now served on Sterling Airways Passenger Advocacy Board. Her experience informed policy decisions and training protocols. James Wright, a black businessman who had been removed from first class on a competitor airline, had become the plaintiff representative in the industry-wide class action lawsuit that was forcing systematic changes across aviation. Dr. Angela Foster, whose viral video of discrimination on another carrier had sparked congressional hearings, was now consulting with the FAA on new anti-bias regulations that would apply to all commercial aviation. The changes we've implemented at Sterling Airways are now becoming industry standards, Mabel continued. Every major carrier is adopting similar protocols because federal regulators, shareholders, and passengers are demanding accountability. The summit audience included representatives from airlines worldwide who were studying the Sterling Airways model for implementation in their own companies. The discrimination case that began with one woman being removed from one seat had become a global movement for aviation equality. But Mabel's proudest achievement wasn't the industry recognition or regulatory changes. It was the transformation of Sterling Airways into the company she had originally envisioned. The quarterly board meeting that morning had shown results that vindicated her approach. Customer loyalty was at an all-time high. Employee satisfaction had increased dramatically, and revenue had grown by 23% as Sterling Airways became known as the airline that treated every passenger with dignity. Our financial performance has improved because our cultural performance has improved, Mabel had told the board. When you eliminate discrimination, you don't lose customers, you gain them. When you treat all passengers with respect, you don't compromise excellence, you achieve it. Janet Chen, who had retained her position but now reported directly to the Chief Diversity Officer on all personnel matters, had presented remarkable data. Sterling Airways was now the preferred carrier for diverse business travelers. Their Net Promoter Score had increased by 45 points, and they had become the industry leader in inclusive customer service.
The company that had once silenced discrimination complaints now published quarterly diversity reports. The airline that had once trained crew members to profile passengers now led industry conferences on bias elimination. The corporate culture that had once protected discriminatory employees now celebrated advocates for equality. As Mabel concluded her summit presentation, she reflected on the journey from humiliation to transformation. The discrimination she experienced had been devastating, but it had also revealed the systematic problems that needed to be addressed. Her decision to demand justice rather than accept compensation had created changes that would benefit millions of future passengers. The most important lesson we've learned, she told the audience, is that discrimination isn't eliminated by good intentions or diversity statements. It's eliminated by systematic change, individual accountability, and the courage to acknowledge when our institutions have failed their foundational values. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of Sterling Airways' transformation. It was acknowledgement of a new era in aviation, where passenger dignity was protected by policy, bias was addressed through training, and discrimination was prevented through systematic vigilance. After the summit, Mabel returned to Atlanta and Sterling Airways headquarters, where a familiar ritual awaited. The weekly all-company meeting where employees shared stories of positive passenger interactions, discussed challenges in providing equitable service, and celebrated progress in building an inclusive culture. Everly Hall took the podium first. sharing how she had helped a nervous first-time flyer feel welcome in first class. Logan Jarvis followed, describing how new pilot protocols had helped him identify and address potential bias in cabin service. Dr. Sarah Kim presented data showing continued improvement in passenger satisfaction across all demographic groups. Janet Chen announced new partnerships with civil rights organizations to ensure ongoing accountability. As Mabel listened to her employees celebrate their transformation from discrimination perpetrators to inclusion advocates, she felt the satisfaction of a vision finally realized. Sterling Airways had become what she had always intended, an airline that measured success not just by profit margins and on-time performance, but by the dignity and respect shown to every passenger who trusted them with their journey. The discrimination that had shattered her faith in her own company had ultimately become the catalyst for creating the company she had always dreamed of building. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through redemption. Not through punishment, but through transformation. Sterling Airways Flight 447 to Miami was preparing for departure, the same route where Mabel's discrimination had occurred 6 months earlier. But now, crew members had been trained to recognize bias, passengers were protected by advocacy protocols, and the culture celebrated inclusion rather than exclusion. The seat that had once been denied to the airline's owner because of her race was now available to any passenger who had earned it through their ticket purchase, regardless of their appearance, background, or assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins. The circle was complete. Justice had taken flight. How do we measure the true success of justice? By the punishment of wrongdoers, or by the systematic changes that prevent future wrongs? From discrimination to transformation, this incredible journey shows how one person's courage to demand justice can change entire industries. Share this story to inspire others to stand up against bias and create systemic change. Subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and redemption.
You've come to the end of this love story, but another billionaire's secret is waiting. The next tale will be more seductive, more forbidden, and far more addictive. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Until then, guard your heart, because the Powder Room Tales is only getting started.